Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Good to see you, Alexandra and Gabby. Shabbat Shalom. Welcome to Sabbath Collective. We're a community of people interested in celebrating the Sabbath and pursuing God through a Hebraic worldview of the Bible. So, we've been doing a sort of broad overview of the book of Revelation. And we're not going to get into the judgments and the trumpets and the horsemen and the tribulation because as much as I tried, it's really too dense to do on a Facebook Live teaching. For those of you who are members, though, I posted an article that goes into depth about the symbolism of these images in the Sabbath Collective Facebook membership group for you. However, I will say this about that. When prophecy unfolds, we oftentimes say to ourselves, yes, of course it would be like this. It's sort of simple and even obvious in that it was sort of there all along. So, in other words, prophecy isn't something that just drops out of thin air. When it happens, when prophecy is fulfilled, we actually realize, oh yes, I saw that coming all along. And everything sort of comes together. So, let's ask ourselves, what if, as it relates to all of the judgments in the book of Revelation? What if these things spoken about are not Yahweh's originating these awful beasts and plagues and disasters? Hey Aaron, Shabbat Shalom. Hey Bandit, glad you're reunited. I would sing for you, but not. What if these plagues and beasts and disasters didn't come from heaven, but rather they originated on earth? In fact, we're already getting a glimpse of them now. What if the judgment prophecies that we read about in Revelation are the fulfillment of what is already in existence? Let's look at this another way. Humans are using fossil fuel and other things for the sake of greed and selfishness, denying scientific facts so that we can continue, and we are impacting the climate, which is causing serious effects. With storms, with natural disasters. Who created these conditions? We did. Now, you know, once you know better, you do better, right? But when you know better and you don't do better, that's sin. And sin is what the judgments in the book of Revelation are all about. People that make their own gods and turn away from the one true God. Let's look at something else. Humans invented chemicals that kill living things in humans and in animals and in the earth that we define as bad. But the larger motivation, even for that, is often greed as well. Humans, animals, and the earth are all closely connected, as Bandit will tell you. We're dependent upon one another. And in doing so, we have poisoned the earth, we have poisoned its animals, and we have poisoned our own bodies. Once we knew better, we didn't do better. Now, I'm using broad strokes here, but you understand the concepts of what I'm saying. The results are on our planet. Farm factories have taken over. Pesticides have infiltrated everything that goes into our bodies. And medicines, even when we don't take them, we are still ingesting them. In our livestock, we see the same thing. And we are brutally abusing our animals and feedlots, and because they are getting sick, then we give them drugs. And then we're eating the meat of those animals that have lived a life of torture. We look at food like dairy or meat or fish or vegetables or fruits as commodities. This is a completely anti-biblical way to relate to them. And part of this delusion is that we have disconnected from the earth completely. And hey, Evelyn, we don't think there's a problem, but glad you could join us. So we have disconnected from the earth completely. in ways that started very subtly, but are complete in their disconnection. We no longer put our feet in the grass. Instead, we wear shoes because outside is dirty. We no longer get out in the sun. We put sunscreen on because the sun is now our enemy. And we use antibacterials to kill anything that has gotten on our skin because we think all bacteria is bad. So our internal biomes are so loaded with chemicals that our cells are not able to communicate with each other and function as the holistic, unified being that we were designed to be. We're attached to our phones, and so are our children. And we live in a cocoon of non-native EMFs. We see all kinds of diseases that we've never seen before. Most of them are man-made. The disconnection from our world is complete. And listen, when you look at some of these pathogens and cancers and viruses and bacterias under a microscope, they sort of look or act like the creatures described in Revelation that are attacking the humans. And the storms sort of sound like the result of climate change. The wars, we can definitely see where that comes from, right? And there's a disconnection there too with people groups being less than the others. What if all the makings of all the judgments are already in place? We made them. And God will simply unleash the consequences of our own greed, our own pride, our own entitlement, and our abandonment of stewardship and respect for this planet and its inhabitants. You probably remember hearing the phrase, the Hebrew phrase, mida keneged mida, which means measure for measure. What if that's what the judgments were really about? And it all makes complete sense. We are doing it and we're reaping the consequences of it. So I'm going to look at a text tonight, and it's going to be the final teaching for this series. And we're going to start out sort of verse by verse. So Revelation 21, 1 through 7 says in Revelation 1, or verse 1, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the old heaven and the old earth had passed away, and the sea was no longer there." Hey, Julie, great to see you, honey. So there's a Hebrew phrase that translates heaven as Shamayim Kadasha, which means the waters of the sky that are new. It is this place of life-giving water offered to all who are thirsty. Now, this was not a uniquely Christian thought. At the time of Yochanan's recording of Revelation here, given to him by Yeshua, the Jewish people had been waiting for new heavens and a new earth for hundreds of years. And again, we always talk about the connection between the New Testament and the Old Testament. New Testament doesn't replace the Old Testament, it fulfills it. In around 740 BCE, Isaiah recorded these words from God: "Behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former shall not be remembered nor come into mind." There's also the Hebrew prophecy that promises the redemption of ethnic Israel in Isaiah 66:22. It says, "For just as the new heavens and the new earth which I make will endure before me, declares Hashem, so your offspring and your name will endure." New heaven and new earth. Watching from Nashville Airport. That's cool, Jules. Glad you could join us. Western culture is fascinated with the new, right? But we always think that the new is a replacement of the old. And that's not the case in the biblical sense. When it speaks of the new, it's speaking about the restoration of all things. In the Greek, there are two interesting words for new. One is neos, which means young in terms of duration, like royal and legend, right? Young. The other word is kainos, which appears in this passage 4 times. which means new in terms of quality. Kainos means fresh, unprecedented, and unworn. That is such a cool meaning, isn't it? Fresh, unprecedented, and unworn. In our culture, we think of new as young. But in Hebrew culture, new is quality, it's freshness, it's unprecedented, it's functioning with an energy and a light according to design. Now, if you've been a follower of Yahweh for any length of time, you already know this. Even if just with your relationship with scriptures, you read a text and suddenly it comes alive, right? Even though you've read it many, many, many times. But that text is actually ancient. That's kainos. It's fresh, it has light, it has energy. And when you see it, that's new. What we are drawn to in our DNA, because this is what we're moving towards, is newness. But listen, just like the draw to intimacy that is replaced by a placebo of other kinds of connection that are really far from intimacy, like social media and hookups and all of them attempt to intimately connect, but they're all missing the mark and leave us empty and longing, right? That's what happens when we seek intimacy, which is a God-given longing, and replace it with something that's counterfeit. We actually see the same concept here with the draw towards newness. Kainos is swapped out for neos. Now you can see why all of the focus on staying young and on getting new stuff. But it's not the way. It's counterfeit. And we somehow sense that. Now, there will be a moment, we read, that the King, the Creator, comes back and everything will be renewed. We don't fully understand what that'll look like, but we do know that there will be life. Every created thing will bloom. Hey, Melissa, great to see you. Hola. The no sea part probably refers to the not having the Dead Sea, which sort of symbolizes nothing living. So there'll be water, but there won't be a Dead Sea. There's a whole new earth, and it's something we can really only imagine. I encourage you after we end tonight to read chapter 22 with your imagination wide open, like you've never read it before, and let yourself think of the words that you're picture them as you're reading them. So these thoughts of new may kind of sound like escapism. You know how some say religion is the opiate of the people, right? But since we know that escapism is not part of the Hebraic worldview, in fact, we should occupy this world and care about what happens and work towards bringing God's justice and love and peace into the world, not just wait till we die so we can go to heaven. That's not the Hebraic worldview, and certainly not the point of Revelation. What does this thought of new heavens and new earth mean to me right now? Well, again, we talked about this earlier. This book was written to people experiencing enormous persecution, the degree that most of us will never, ever experience in our lifetime. And through this, they got the kind of truth they needed to face it, even at the point of having holes drilled in their head with hot iron poured in it or facing lions. And it was so amazing how much peace they had in that the Romans even were impacted by the way they did this. They drew hope from knowing these things and believing these things. Hebraic faith comes through truth and actions. Not through 16 tenets of faith that you say you believe with your whole heart, and not through techniques where you go to conferences and learn how to manifest things that you want. Paul says in Romans 8:18, he says, I don't think the sufferings we are going through now are even worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed to us in the future. And Paul suffered a lot. He was beaten, he was whipped, he was tortured, he was imprisoned, all kinds of things. He went through it. But look, he says, I don't think that these even compare with what we're going to see in the future. The phrase I don't think is the Greek word logizomai, which means to count, to compute, or to consider. So the sufferings are nothing compared to the glory revealed. So you don't have to wait for some sort of supernatural infusion of power like it just comes from some external force. You've already got what you need. You just need to consider it, like those being persecuted did. Consider the truths and do them. Again, it's not a mental assent to belief. It's a contemplation of truth. So we continue with verse 2. Also I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared like a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. Now, among several other verses, Isaiah and Ezekiel, this is actually the city that Abraham looked forward to in faith. Hebrews 11:9 through 10 says, by faith he lived as an alien in the land of promise, in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise, for he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. So even Abraham was connected to this. Again, Christians always try to own this as it's some sort of only for Christians, right? It goes all the way back to Abraham, who knew that there was a city that God was going to be the builder of. Galatians 4:26 says, but the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. That's a beautiful verse, isn't it? Verse 3. It continues. I heard a loud voice from the throne say, see, God's Shekinah is with mankind. That's the glory of God, Shekinah. And he will live with them. They will be his people, and he himself, God with them, will be their God. This verse is really best understood by making a connection to its foreshadowing in Numbers 2, where the tribes of Israel are encamped around the dwelling place of God's presence in the tent of meeting, or the Mishkan. And the glory of God is with them. The Hebrew word Mishkan comes from the root shekan, meaning to dwell. So God actually lived with them there. And this shows a kind of intimate connection which marriage mirrors, which is why it talks about the bride. It's this very close, intimate connection. Adonai will be literally living with us, which is amazing to think about. Verse 4, he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will no longer be any death, and there will no longer be any mourning, crying, or pain, because the old order has passed away. No more crying is a Hebrew metaphor for no suffering, no sorrow. And we read no death. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? We say this all the time and we think about it, the new heaven and the new earth, and we think of the place where there's going to be no suffering and no crying, but we live in a state of so much suffering. Andre just posted about another death of a young girl by border police, shot. I don't know all the story, but I just noticed it about an hour ago. My heart broke. My heart breaks almost daily for what is going on in our world, and that isn't even related to me personally. I have my own heartbreaks personally, as you do. Can you imagine a place where there is no sorrow? And can you take that as a hope? The same way the readers of Yochanan's letter did with what they were going through. Verse 5, he goes on, then the one sitting on the throne said, look, I am making everything new. Also he said, write, these words are true and trustworthy. In Judaism, the Shemat Rabbah, which is actually the commentary to Exodus, to the book of Exodus, and again, this is a Judaism thought, okay? It says this, and I want you to listen to this, and this was written sometime in the 12th century, right? It says, the holy blessed God will make 10 things new in the Olam Haba, the world to come. So again, this is Judaism. I'm going to let you see how it mirrors the book of Revelation. The first, it goes on, the first is he will enlighten the world. And we see that in Revelation 21:11. The second is he will bring living water out of Jerusalem. Revelation 21:6. The third is he will make trees to bring forth their fruit every month. Revelation 22:2. And the fourth is all the waste places shall be built, even Sodom and Gomorrah. The fifth is Jerusalem shall be built with sapphire stone. We see those in Revelation 21:19. The sixth is the cow and the bear shall feed. The seventh is a covenant shall be made between Israel and the beasts, fowls, and creeping things. The eighth is there shall be no more weeping and howling in the world. Revelation 21:4. The ninth is there shall be no more death in the world. Revelation 21:4 again. And the 10th is there shall be no more sighing and groaning and sorrow in the world. And again, we see that in verse 4 as well. So we see that this text really mirrors what is written in a commentary, a Jewish commentary. So this is ancient hope. Even before John wrote this letter, this has been ancient hope imparted from God to his people. Verse 6 says, and he said to me, it is done. I am the A and the Z, the beginning and the end. To anyone who is thirsty, I myself will give water free of charge from the fountain of life. And the phrase it is done is actually a plural in the Greek, it's really translated better, they are done. In other words, all the events that were to lead up to this point have been completed. Alpha and Omega, we talked about this early. In Hebrew, it's Aleph and Tav. And we spoke about this in the first meeting. It's the first letter of the alphabet and the last. It means the beginning and the ends, with everything in between. It's inclusive. It says here, water without cost. And that's a familiar Hebrew idiom. So you remember we began the chapter with a revelation of the source of the living water, which is the heavens, Shamayim, and are now shown that the source has come to earth and is offered to the thirsty as Mayim Chaim in Hebrew, the waters of eternal life. Psalm 36:9 says, for with you, God, is the Mayim Chaim, the fountain of life. In your light shall we see light. So the interesting and really encouraging thing about this is, who gets the water that we need for life? It says anyone who's thirsty. This is very inclusive. This is not only this group that looks like this and acts like this. This is anyone who is thirsty gets the waters of life. John 7:37, Yeshua said this, anyone who is thirsty can come to me and drink. And finally in verse 7, it says, he who wins the victory will receive these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. And the way that the Hebraic literature is when it says he will be my son, and that's an inclusive phrase as well. You could say sons and daughters. The phrase he who wins occurs 7 times in chapters 2 and 3 in Revelation. And it refers to every individual who in the Messiah overcomes sin. Now, what does overcome sin mean? It doesn't mean that you never sin. It simply means to overcome sin simply means that you are walking and practicing teshuvah, which we've talked about. To do this is, or repentance, and as we say in English, to do this is, if here's God over here, and here is something that separates us from God over here, that is outside of God's will for us, and we take our eyes off of God, we stop walking on that road to God, and our attention goes to what is separating us from God, whatever that may be, And we begin to follow after that and do anything that that tells us to do so that we can have it. Now we're facing this, we're serving this, right? And we've turned our back on the Lord. Teshuvah is to return to. It simply means that we turn from this and we turn back towards the Lord. And a lot of people, a lot of rabbinic sources say that you know that you have done a complete tshuva when you have the opportunity to do the same thing again and you don't. And that's what overcoming sin is. You've turned back towards the Lord. You no longer serve this thing that separates you from the Lord and always separates you from other people, from other relationships. But if you have the same opportunity to do it again, you don't. So, and we live a lifestyle of tshuva. We continuously sometimes lose our way and then come back. And that's all this means. And when we do this, we are overcomers. Revelation 12:1 says they defeated him, speaking of the dragon, because of the blood of the Lamb, who is Yeshua, and his blood that he gave for us actually is for the atonement for us. It covers over and removes our sin completely, and because of their testimony. So what this text says is how the dragon is defeated is because of what Yeshua did for us and because of our testimony, which is how we live. And that is the story of this text. Now, when we started this, we read a verse, Revelation 1:3, because everyone hears all this crazy stuff about Revelation. It's so confusing. There's all this violence and blah, 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 and all these crazy creatures, and there's dragons and monsters, and it could be a little intense. However, Revelation 1:3 says, "Blessed are the readers and the hearers of the words of this prophecy, if they obey the things written in it." So all of us are blessed when we simply read or hear the words in Revelation. And then, as you know, Hebrew Shema, I'm like Carol Burnett there, Hebrew Shema, if you hear, you do. That's what the word means, Shema. It's not just like you just kind of, oh yeah, I hear what you're saying. To hear, to really hear means you hear it and you do it. And Revelation 1:3 says when that happens, you're blessed. So we are concluding this series on Revelation. And we're going to close this time with the lighting of the Shabbos candles. Now, traditionally, the mothers light the candles. The mothers of the home light the candles. And the Sabbath candles, the candles of Shabbos, represent light and unity and peace and joy. And then she typically encircles her hands around them 3 times. And what that does is it's a symbol, it's a gesture of welcoming in the Sabbath, because tonight at sunset, the Sabbath begins and all work stops. Then she prays as she covers her eyes. And what that symbolizes is that she's shutting out the work of the week. Blessed are you, Yahweh our God, King of the universe, who has set us apart by his commandments, who has given us Yeshua the Messiah, and has sent us to be a light to the world. And then we close together, the Lord is our light and our salvation. May his light be felt in this space as the enlightenment of truth and the radiance of joy. Amen. Shabbat Shalom.